Well, good afternoon. Welcome. This is a rather special session. It's not a very long session, but it's a rather special one in many ways. This is the 20th edition of Brussels Forum, and we thought it would be very appropriate to have a session devoted to Brussels Forum, how it came about, how it's evolved, animating ideas, all of those things. And we're really delighted to have with us Carl Bildt, who has been a friend of the event since the very, very beginning, and in fact was present at the creation, if I can say, along with a number of others like Javier Solana, but also a very, very valued dear colleague who's you will see on the screen here, and this session is in honor of him. Ron Asmus was a leading, I would say, not just policy intellectual, but in a sense policy entrepreneur at GMF and in other settings. We actually were at the RAND Corporation together for many years before he became the Brussels office director here for GMF, and then I came. He was really instrumental in bringing people together to think about how to do something like this. And we'll talk a little bit about how that evolved. But I think it's really very important. He was a key figure for GMF, and the opportunity to commemorate him in a sense here is really a wonderful thing to do. So please bear that in mind. And Carl, let me maybe talk to you a little bit about how this started. But before I do that, I just wanted to look out to the audience and ask how many of you were at the first Brussels Forum? Okay.
Survivors.
Wow. And how many were, say, with us in the first decade of it? More survivors. Terrific. I think what that tells you is that, well, two things. First of all, people have stuck with us, but secondly, we also like to refresh the audience, and we've done that, I think, quite successfully as well. This has evolved in all kinds of different ways. It's given, I think, birth to other formats like this. Maybe we can talk a little bit about that. So it's had an effect, I think, that went beyond the forum itself. It was very unique at the beginning. But Carl, maybe I can come to you and talk a bit about what the animating idea was, some of the personalities involved. What were you trying to do with it?
Well, the personalities were the ones that you indicated. I mean, there was Craig Kennedy who was president, I think. He had, of the DMF, he had, to be brutally, he had the money. And Ron had the ideas and the drive. And then you had a supporting cast of Javier Solana, who was the high representative at the moment. There were people like myself and others. And we said, there's a need for something. There was nothing. There was nothing virtually. There was the Munich Security Conference, which was more for those days. You had to be general or an ambassador or a member of a government or something like that. But we wanted to have something that was much broader in terms of think tankers and policy people and journalists and people who had ideas and thoughts. That was the thing. And do it in Brussels. Munich was purely security. The European Union was clearly going to be a more major actress. All of the enlargement issues were there at the time. So bring these diverse groups, transatlantic, of all sorts of people together. That was novel. There was nothing like it. And it was a smashing success.
And the format was very innovative.
The format was yes, absolutely. The place, Brussels, the format, the fact that there was very different kinds of people of different sorts. And it was,
On the issues, I mean, one of the things Ron was known for was he was a real thought leader on enlargement, NATO enlargement, EU enlargement. I mean, and that whole sort of spirit really, I think, animated a lot of the early sessions and discussions.
There was clearly that. I mean, there was you remember that. We talked about Europe, whole and free, democratic and dynamic. He was, of course, one of the absolute leaders in the US debate on NATO enlargement, which, as we have been reminded of, was somewhat controversial at times. Pentagon was against, to take one. But also the European Union. And Ron was one of the people on the other side of the pond who really understood the European Union. Not very many of those in those days. Still, somewhat difficult at times.
No?
I don't blame them. The European Union is a fairly difficult creature to understand sometimes. But Ron did understand it. And the importance of not only NATO enlargement, but EU enlargement in order to create whole and free, democratic and dynamic. And then what we talked about at the time, of course, a ring of friends surrounding this Europe, turned into a ring of fire later on. But in the beginning, that was driving the entire intellectual enterprise.
And in some ways, the Forum, I mean, if you think back to the Georgia War, he'd written a book on that.
Yes.
He was in some ways in the vanguard of thinking of that as not just an isolated incident, but rather as the harbinger of something that would be much more competitive and dangerous with Russia.
Ron was taking people to strange places. I mean, I remember a lengthy debate we had about something where we didn't have quite the same views. I can't remember what it was. But we were sitting on a rainy pier in Abkhazia. I mean, how many sitting in rain in Abkhazia? I mean, first, how many people have been to Abkhazia and how many people have been in rain in Abkhazia? Because normally it doesn't rain in Abkhazia. That's typical Ron. You took people who had never been there, took them to places, we got to know them, we got to know people, and we generated ideas, and then brought them to Brussels. And I think, as you indicate, I think the success of the Brussels Forum is that it's now a very different space. I mean, there's only one Brussels Forum, but there are quite a number of others. I mean, there are sons and daughters of Brussels Forum all over the place. We've seen a proliferation of these things, which is extremely good, because it has created a sort of an intellectual ecosystem of dialogues between policymakers, thinkers, journalists, policy shapers, all sorts of people that wasn't there before. And we have, I mean, you pointed out there's GlobeSec at the moment, and
no, we were just chatting before we started our session. There are three forums. They're not exactly the same, but drawing in similar ways on similar issues going on in Europe this week. Actually, GlobeSec.
Yeah, GlobeSec. You have Raisina is of course Indian, and that has drawn inspiration from Brussels Forum as well.
Absolutely.
So the fact that it's not only proliferated in Europe, it's proliferated around the world.
Absolutely. Atlantic Dialogues, which we did ourselves, Halifax, the Delphi Forum. I mean, the list really goes on.
Oh yeah.
I think we would probably all agree that to have these kinds of conversations is, especially today, is extremely important. But what really should they look like today? I mean, before I open it up to all of you, because we'll have about 10 minutes before we shift to our next session. But what would you do differently with something like this today, Carl?
I don't know, but
we don't know either.
No, but we need to think about it, because I mean, what has happened is, of course, that we have no access. I mean, the internet certainly did exist 20 years ago, no question about that. But we went through COVID, and we learned that you could do things on the screen, and we can access debates in much different ways. In much the same way as this Brussels Forum is all over the digital world, and I don't know how many people are listening to us all over Europe these days. At the same time, I think we've also learned you can't replace that possibility to sit down and gossip in a corner with someone. I mean, the value is not only what we do here on the stage, but the value is also that particular gossip that you do in the corner at the reception and whatever, breakfast. That is irreplaceable. And we need to think about that when we discuss what's going to be the shape of the next 20 years.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Let me, if I can, just open it up to all of you. I know some of you, as we were asking earlier, have been here since, in a sense, the beginning. I welcome your questions, but also if you have some reflections on it briefly, I'd be happy to hear them. Michal, please. You really were here at the beginning. I think you were now a minister. You were actually Ron's trainee, if I'm not mistaken, at one point.
Mm-hmm.
Michał Baranowski, correct minister now, correct with Carl at all Brussels forums. I think there is one other person who has been to all of them, and I was I started as a trainee. I think by the time we had Brussels Forum, I was upgraded to program assistant or something like that. But one little comment that I think that, so Ron, who has been not only a dear friend, but also a mentor, his favorite way of working was plotting. Plotting, so actually having all the friends and thinkers, like Karl, like Radek Sikorski, like Tom Ilves, and bringing the ideas to action. Ron was never about observing reality, but about changing reality. And Brussels Forum was part of that. It was part of action. And that was, I think, something that really also give it a boost. It's more of a comment than a question, but it's so fantastic to see you and be at the Brussels Forum for the 20th time. Yeah, thanks.
Terrific. Maya, I think it's Maya. I'm looking, it's in the, yeah, please.
Hi, I'm Maya Camo, and I actually too was at the very first Brussels Forum, and it was one of the greatest honors of my life to be there at that time. But I remember Ron Asmus came to me, and I was leading GMF's government affairs program, and he said, Maya, we need senators at this event. You've got to get them here. And I think the way you need to do it is you need to get a US government plane. And I went, Ron, I don't know how to do that. And he said, well, there's one that goes to Munich, and so we clearly need one to come to the Brussels Forum, and that was, and we managed to pull it off, and so we had a large codel that very first year, and I think that continued for a long time after, but it was a remarkable time, and this has been a very special session, so thank you.
Absolutely.
And it was, that should be remembered, that was John McCain, if I remember. And John McCain was the one who was, in those days, able to do small wonders with US government planes and ordering US senators around, irrespectively of party. So we had sort of personality, I mean, bigger person, well, we have still big personalities, but I mean, we had people around like John McCain, Dick Holbrooke, and others who were really
absolutely
doing things. Creating a lot of friends, a lot of enemies, by the way, as well, because I mean they were not entirely diplomatic at times, has to be said.
Yeah, that may be true. In fact, I remember, at least I think it was Brussels Forum, not one of the other events, but where you had a plane full of this delegation, and they never got here. The plane broke down, and they had to watch it on a screen in Canada, if I remember. So odd things have happened along the line. Xenia, please. The microphone is winging its way towards you.
Xenia Wickett Advisory. I wasn't here at the first, but I've been quite a number. And nearly, exactly. One of the things I observe, and I've been observing over the last 24 hours, and when you look at the pictures, you observe it, just how many women are in the room and how many young people are in the room. And if you look at the old pictures, that is not the case. And I know for many years, I used to get a tap on the shoulder saying, Xenia, will you please ask a question, because we need a woman to ask a question, right? That is not the case today. The other thing that I observe is that increasingly over those 20 years, you've had other voices in the room. So it's not just policymakers. You've had business leaders, as you did yesterday with the CEO of ExxonMobil. So my question back to you, you asked the question in what does the next Brussels Forum look like? What do we need to do as we look to the future? And so my question for you is, if picking up Ron's mission of having impact, effecting change, who needs to be in the room tomorrow in order to do that in the world in which we live today?
Carl?
Well, one thing which I think if you go back and sort of memory fades over time, but we had, as you said, we had business leaders there from the beginning, but it was more the traditional big business, What we need now is, of course, the new technology entrepreneurs of different sorts. I mean, I just went to a session where we discussed the prospects of biotechnology. IT is old news, but quantum and all of those particular things. We have a much more dynamic, revolutionary technology landscape that is changing our economies and our societies in ways we did not see 20 years ago. Then the big changes, of course, I mean, we should not beat about that particular bush. We have a profound crisis in the transatlantic relationship. In those days, we had a fairly, I wouldn't say that it was without tension, but we had a fairly harmonious relationship. Take the Holbrooke, John McCain era from that point of view. And remember how we just after that we went into the big, you remember the TTIP exercise?
Yeah.
Some of you might not be aware of it. A big project to integrate sort of free trade and technology across the Atlantic. Now we have trade wars. Then we had more than peace. We had complete trade integration. We had the same view on the strategic environment in Europe, Russia and things like that. We didn't have that aggressive Russia in those, but we had a problematic Russia. We had Russians at the Brussels Forum, by the way.
Absolutely.
Slightly problematic at times, and we had some divergences. We have that between nations, but we didn't have the sort of the problems that we have now. And we had the same broad strategic outlook between Washington and Brussels. Now we have a strategic diverge, we have an economic diverge, and we have a culture war. So it's slightly problematic.
Other comments or reflections from, or even indeed on the future? Just on the aisle, right there, please.
Thanks, Ian. Mark Szymakowski. I'm have my own firm, Heartland Global Advisors. I was lucky enough to actually be the first Asmus Fellow back in 2012. And for me, as Ron's legacy was not only policy entrepreneurship, but connecting young people with leaders around the world. And that's what Brussels Forum has always been about, and something that it is. But most importantly is, as Michal said, translating those ideas into action. Ron would love the time we're in now, because it's filled with problems and it's filled with challenges. And of course, it's going to take people to create opportunities for those challenges. And he actually would have focused on the same issues that plagued him, was how do you incorporate Europe's East into the transatlantic institutions that have served our strength. And so he would have jumped into this problem set. He was always focused on the Black Sea to the Baltic Sea as an area. I think the challenge for us is, again, as we've moved east, the challenge has only become bigger. And how do we dive in a way that's positive? I think Brussels Forum needs to continue to serve that dialogue, but also being able to bring leaders from Georgia, Ukraine. You don't see those leaders here at this conference. It's a really difficult time. And Ron also was able to somehow try to navigate what's Russia's role in Europe's East as well. And he always looked at it in both sides. So again, I know none of us have these answers, but I always think about what would Ron do. Many of us lament that he didn't get a last chance to serve in government, particularly in a previous administration, because of his untimely death. But I do think a lot of the drivers of the challenges in Europe's East, we have to think through how we would approach these problems with Ron's very effective mindset.
Mark, thank you. I'm conscious of our time, but I just wanted to come back to you, Carl, if I may, just with a final opportunity for thought. Do we need to be more global? Whatever the format, whatever kind of forum, wherever it is, whatever we're doing at GMF in the strategic convening space, do we need to think more imaginatively about, what is that transatlantic constituency? Should we be thinking about it more in north-south terms, as we have had, but could we reinforce it, an even greater Indo-Pacific reach? What's the next thing in that respect? Issues, people.
Well, I think we need to. I very much second that. I mean, the east of Europe still should be fairly obviously to say that these days. But I mean, Brussels is the center of the European Union, and it is the center of the European Union because that was a compromise in 1956 or 57 because they couldn't agree on everything else, and it's in the very west of Europe. Very west of Europe. It's a long way to the east. So mentally, that affects the Brussels mindset. So we need to bridge that mental gap. Then the word is a more relevant place these days than it was 20 years ago. That sounds like a bizarre statement. But I mean, we have the Indians, we have the Latin Americans, we have the trade issues that are global issues. We have technology that's gone global. So we need to sort of bring in the word and bring us out to the word more than I think was the case 20 years ago. Where we were, I wouldn't say that we were unconscious of the word, clearly we weren't. But the word is closer to us and we are more integrated with the word and it's more sort of relevant now than it was 20 years ago. And that needs to be taken into account the one way or the other.
Absolutely. Carl, thank you very much. Please join me in thanking Carl Bildt for these reflections, for the ideas for the future. We're very grateful. And in fact, it becomes a very, very useful, Mark, in particular your last comment in our last conversation, way to go into our next session, which is actually about civil society's role in building democratic resilience, lessons from Central and Eastern Europe. And to moderate that conversation, we're really delighted to have with us, and I'll welcome him here, Stanley Pignal from The Economist. Stanley, please. Thank you.
Thanks.
Good to see you.